Why does the West constantly assume that Africa needs them? Is it because African leaders have silently given that impression? Or is it just the same old superiority complex, masked as foreign aid, military support, and strategic partnerships? Recently, that mindset became crystal clear. General Michael Langley, the Commander of U.S. Africom, stood before a group of African leaders and made a request that sounded more like a command. He told them to ask the U.S. president to let the American military remain in Africa. He wasn't asking if African countries wanted the U.S. military there. He was asking them to lobby Washington on his behalf, to convince a foreign president that his troops should stay on African soil. The reason? President Trump reportedly intends to reduce America's military presence on the continent. But the real question is, did any African leader actually say they were happy with U.S. troops stationed in their countries? Did they beg General Langley to stay? Or is this another example of a Western official speaking for Africa without ever truly listening? What exactly gives Africom the impression that it's entitled to remain in Africa, that its presence is not just accepted, but essential? These are the questions we're going to unpack in today's video, because behind the diplomatic language lies a much deeper issue, one that speaks to the very heart of Africa's struggle for sovereignty and the West's ongoing refusal to let go. A few weeks ago, General Michael Langley landed in Kenya to attend the annual African Defense Chiefs Conference, an event organized by U.S. Africom every year since 2017. On the surface, it seemed like just another military summit, but beneath the handshakes and photo ops, something much deeper was brewing. At a press conference ahead of the event, General Langley made headlines. He spoke about U.S. counterterrorism operations on the continent, defended his controversial remarks about Burkina Faso's President Ibrahim Traore, and then dropped a bombshell. The Trump administration is actively considering whether Africom, America's military command in Africa, should be dismantled and merged with U.S. European Command. To understand how serious this is, we have to go back to February. That's when President Donald Trump made a move that rattled the U.S. military establishment. He fired the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General C.Q. Brown, and forced out 5 more high-ranking generals and admirals. It wasn't just a military shuffle, it was a purge. And it was done in the name of one guiding principle: America first. In the weeks that followed, whispers turned into reports. The Pentagon was quietly weighing a plan to dissolve Africom altogether, folding it under the umbrella of European Command. It wasn't officially announced, but the signs were clear. Defense insiders began leaking details, and the message was unmistakable. Africom's days as an independent command might be numbered. Why? According to proponents of the move, it's all about efficiency. They claim that merging Africom into EUCOM would streamline operations, cut bureaucratic overhead, and simplify command structures. But critics aren't convinced. They say it's not just about structure, it's about strategy, about power, about shifting America's military focus away from Africa. And if that's true, then the future of Africom isn't just a question of policy, it's a symbol of a deeper shift, one that could redefine Africa's relationship with the United States and reshape the balance of military influence across the continent. When the news first broke, most people dismissed it as just another Washington rumor, whispers of a Pentagon shakeup, a quiet plan to roll back America's military footprint in Africa. But now, it's no longer speculation. The Commander of U.S. Africom himself, General Michael Langley, has confirmed it publicly. The United States is preparing to reduce its military presence on the African continent. But Langley didn't just confirm the restructuring. He said something far more revealing, something that's the real focus of today's story. I've talked to a number of ministers of defense and a few presidents and told them we were assessing, Langley admitted. These weren't passing conversations. They were deliberate discussions with Africa's top leadership. And then came the part that turned heads. Langley called on African governments, those who still value Africom's presence, to make their voices heard in Washington. In his own words, "That's what I tell them. I said, okay, if we're that important to you, you need to communicate that, and we'll see." Read between the lines, and the message is clear. The U.S. military isn't asking for permission, it's demanding validation. If African leaders want American troops to stay, they need to lobby for it, publicly, diplomatically, urgently. What's really happening here is a quiet reversion to pre-2007 strategy. Trump wants to shut down Africom as a standalone military entity, folding it back under the European command, just like it was before Africom was established. On paper, the move is framed as a way to simplify command structures and cut bureaucratic fat. But the geopolitical stakes are much bigger than that. Supporters of the merger argue that it would make it easier to scale back U.S. involvement in places like Somalia, reducing unnecessary risks and aligning with Trump's America First doctrine. But critics warn it's a dangerous retreat. They say downsizing Africom could create a power vacuum across the continent, a vacuum that Russia and China are more than ready to fill. And that's the heart of the debate. Is the U.S. pulling back from Africa to prioritize its own borders? Or is it simply losing its grip on a continent that's beginning to stand on its own? It's no surprise that Africom doesn't want to let go of its independent command in Africa. And now, it's becoming more obvious why General Langley told African leaders to reach out directly to President Trump, not to negotiate, but to plead. Plead that Africom be allowed to stay. But that raises a more uncomfortable question. Is there any African leader who truly believes Africom has been good for the continent? Anyone who thinks that the U.S. military's presence has actually solved Africa's security challenges? Because if such a leader exists, it's hard not to call it what it is: ignorance, or worse, deliberate blindness. To understand why, we need to go back to the time before Africom existed, before 2007. Back when terrorism in Africa made up just 2% of global terror incidents. Think about that, 2%. At the time, America's military footprint in Africa was minimal, modest partnerships, limited operations. U.S. forces then were still under the umbrella of the European Command. The structure was loose, decentralized. It consisted of the Combined Joint Task Force Horn of Africa, based at Camp Lemonnier in Djibouti, with around 1,700 troops. There was also the Trans-Sahara Counterterrorism Initiative and U.S. naval patrols in the Gulf of Guinea. That's the model President Trump now wants to return to, an older framework, before Africom became its own empire. But in 2007, everything changed. President George W. Bush announced the creation of a new, standalone military command, U.S. Africa Command, Africom. The official narrative? To fight terrorism, to promote stability. But the truth lies just beneath the surface. At the time, terrorism in Africa wasn't even a regional crisis, let alone a global one. So why the sudden need for a full military command answering directly to Washington? The answer is simple. Africom was never really about fighting terror. It was about protecting American interests, strategic access, resources, influence, under the guise of counterterrorism. And ever since Africom planted its flag across the continent, terrorism in Africa hasn't declined, it's exploded. What's even more revealing is how Africom didn't arrive in Africa by invitation, but by coercion. African leaders, for the most part, didn't see the need for such a massive foreign military structure on their soil. It wasn't their idea, and it certainly wasn't something the African Union welcomed with open arms. In fact, when the U.S. first proposed Africom, the African Union was deeply skeptical. They feared what many still fear today, that this wasn't about partnership, it was about power, that Africom would undermine the very sovereignty African nations were fighting to protect. And they were right to worry. But instead of respecting that resistance, the U.S. did what it has always done when challenged. It issued threats. Picture the scene. A U.S. delegation arrives in an African capital, proposing to set up a military base. The host country, hesitant and cautious, says no, politely, firmly. The Americans leave, but they don't leave it there. They return, this time with pressure. Not bullets, not bombs, but economic blackmail. Suddenly, that same country is warned. If it refuses to cooperate, it might find itself facing financial consequences. Loans from the World Bank might mysteriously stall. IMF packages might be withheld. Aid might dry up. And development projects? Canceled indefinitely. This wasn't hypothetical. It was standard operating procedure. The U.S. understood the leverage it held, especially as the largest financial contributor to the International Monetary Fund. And it used that leverage like a weapon. Countries that refused to play along with Africom's plans were quietly, but effectively, punished. This is how Africom spread across the continent, not through mutual agreement, not through a call from African leaders, but through pressure, diplomatic threats dressed up as deals, economic intimidation masked as policy. It may sound far-fetched, but that's because it was never meant to be obvious. It was meant to be quiet, calculated, and impossible to resist. One African scholar captured the truth with painful precision. Zora Ahmed put it this way: the kinds of international relationships the United States cultivates in support of its wars fall somewhere in a legal gray zone between consent and coercion. And that's exactly where Africa has been trapped for decades, in that gray zone. On the surface, cooperation. But beneath it, pressure, quiet manipulation. The kind of compliance that comes not from agreement, but from economic desperation. African governments, weighed down by decades of debt and a chronic dependence on foreign loans, often find themselves with no real choice at all. They either align with U.S. security priorities, or they risk losing access to the very financial lifelines their economies rely on. It's not diplomacy, it's not partnership, it's survival. And that's the devastating irony. The same country that constantly speaks about justice, freedom, human dignity, and sovereignty is the one trampling on the sovereignty of entire nations, simply because it has the power to do so. This is how Africom came to stay, not by popular demand, but by quiet coercion, backed by the weight of the dollar and the fear of isolation. Yet even now, Africom insists it's here to help. Over and over again, its leaders declare that their mission is peace, that they are in Africa for the sake of counterterrorism and regional security. In a recent interview, General Langley reinforced that claim, stating boldly that everything the U.S. Africom does is to achieve peace through strength. But when you peel back the layers, when you look at how Africom was born and how it's been sustained, you begin to see a far different story. Not a mission of peace, but a strategy of power. Not partnership, but pressure. Not strength through peace, but peace through control. So, what exactly is the U.S. Africom really doing in Africa? The truth is, we don't fully know. And that's not speculation, that's by design. You see, many of Africom's operations are classified. Even the governments of the African nations where U.S. military bases are hosted often have no full knowledge of what's happening on their own soil. It's a relationship shrouded in secrecy, where power flows in one direction, and trust is optional. For years, Africom insisted it had only one military base on the entire continent, Camp Lemonnier in Djibouti. But that lie unraveled in 2017 when a tragic incident exposed the truth. After a deadly ambush in Niger claimed the lives of 4 American soldiers, the world suddenly learned what had been hidden. The U.S. had not one, but dozens of military outposts spread across Africa, at least 27, operating in the shadows. The lie wasn't just told to African governments, it was told to the American people. And that fact alone raises a chilling question. If Africom is willing to deceive its own citizens, what else is it hiding? Because secrecy of that magnitude doesn't just protect strategy, it protects operations that may be illegal, immoral, or both. Operations like covert drone strikes, regime manipulation, and even assassination attempts carried out far from the eyes of the public. But while Africom hides behind classified files, one thing is clear. The U.S. does not want to bear the cost of war, at least not in American lives. That's why it relies on a little-known tactic called the 127E program. Named after a budgetary code, 127E allows U.S. Special Operations Forces to recruit, train, and deploy local African soldiers to carry out counterterrorism missions on America's behalf. These African troops take the risks, they fight the battles, they die in the field, and all the while, U.S. soldiers operate quietly in the background, pulling the strings. It's marketed as partnership, but what it really is outsourcing. African lives solving American problems, African soldiers paying the price for American policy, and somehow, it's all done in the name of peace. The strategy behind Africom didn't begin with drone strikes or military bases. It goes further back. to the Clinton administration's Africa Crisis Response Initiative in the mid-1990s. That's where the logic was first crafted, a low-risk formula for projecting power in Africa without directly stepping into its conflicts. Scholar Adekai Adebajo summed it up in one brutal sentence. The idea was that Africans would do most of the dying, while the U.S. would do some of the spending, to avoid being drawn into politically risky interventions. That cold equation has shaped U.S. military policy on the continent ever since. By training and equipping local militaries, the U.S. doesn't need to send its own soldiers to the front lines. It can operate in the shadows, waging war without ever declaring one, using African troops as proxies in battles the American public barely knows exist. These elite African units, trained and funded by the U.S., are often hailed as the best of the best, disciplined, efficient, modern. But that's only part of the story. According to a 2019 article in Current Anthropology, these same forces are also the least accountable, and in many cases, the most likely to brutally abuse their authority at home. Instead of strengthening national defense, Africom's approach has often done the opposite. It has fractured militaries from within. In Somalia, for example, the U.S. didn't just train a national army, it trained multiple armed groups, creating a fragmented security landscape where different factions competed for power, funding, and recognition. Rather than unifying the country, this strategy deepened internal divisions. Even within a single army, the impact is corrosive. The creation of elite, Western-trained special forces units often leads to resentment and inequality. Political scientist Ramane Idrissa described it as a military caste system, a situation where privileged soldiers operate above their peers, eroding discipline, hierarchy, and loyalty. And the consequences are far-reaching. A divided army cannot defend a united nation, and an army that answers to foreign powers cannot protect its own people. Africom insists that its mission in Africa isn't to fight wars, but to prevent them. That it's a partnership rooted in peacekeeping, stability, and security. But if that were true, why is almost everything they do cloaked in secrecy? Time and again, African governments have found themselves in the dark, kept out of the loop about the operations carried out by U.S. forces on their own soil. From drone surveillance to special forces raids, missions are launched and completed without full disclosure to host nations. And yet, this is called a partnership. Even the most basic facts, like how many elite American troops are stationed on the continent or where they're deployed, are rarely made public. The African people don't know, their governments don't know, but Africom does, Washington does, and that should raise alarms. If you've seen our report on U.S. secret biolabs in Africa, then you know this goes beyond traditional military operations. With Africom's quiet support, the United States has set up hundreds of laboratories across the continent. While many are said to focus on health and disease research, disturbing new evidence suggests that some of these facilities are being used to experiment on local populations, without consent and without oversight. Recent investigations even point to the development of biological weapons as the core purpose of some of these hidden bases. Let that sink in. Biological weapons research on African soil. So when Africom claims it's in Africa to stop terrorism before it starts, we have to ask, what terrorism exactly? And who benefits from this so-called prevention? Because if their mission was truly about peace and security, why has terrorism and instability spread like wildfire across the Sahel, the Horn of Africa, and beyond? What we're seeing is not prevention, it's provocation, not partnership, but occupation by stealth. Africom doesn't just promote U.S. interests, it protects them, at the expense of African sovereignty, transparency, and trust. The United States military came into Africa under a familiar narrative that the continent couldn't solve its own problems, that African governments were too fragile, that the people were too unprepared. The West would step in to save the day, as always. And so, Africom was born. Its mission? To prevent war before it happens, to stop terrorism in its tracks. That was in 2007. Fast forward nearly 2 decades later, and what do we have? A U.S. military force running secret operations across the continent, deploying elite commandos, operating drones, and building bases hidden from public view. And yet, with all this cutting-edge, high-tech surveillance equipment, they couldn't stop the rise of jihadist movements in Mali. They couldn't contain the spread of Islamist terrorism across the Sahel? Let's be honest, they saw it coming. With their satellites, drones, and spy planes crisscrossing African skies, there's no way Africom wasn't aware of jihadist plans forming on the ground. No way they missed the early warnings. And if they truly didn't know, then that's not just incompetence, it's willful blindness. But here's the harder truth: they didn't act. Not when it started, not when it grew, not when it spread like wildfire across the region. Because the mission was never really about stopping terrorism. Terrorism was the public excuse, the neatly packaged justification for establishing a permanent military presence on African soil. The real goal? To secure U.S. strategic interests, resources, influence, control, not to protect African lives. Africom isn't a shield, it's a lever, a tool to extend American power under the mask of security. And the more you look at its record, the clearer it becomes. This isn't about peace. It never was. Let's be clear, Africom's presence in Africa has very little to do with peace and everything to do with power and profit. The United States isn't in Africa out of goodwill. It's there because Africa is rich, rich in land, rich in minerals, rich in untapped potential. The continent holds 30% of the world's mineral reserves, 12% of its oil, 8% of its natural gas, and a staggering 65% of the globe's arable land. That's not just wealth, that's leverage. But despite this abundance, Africa remains dependent, locked into an economic structure built during colonial rule, when foreign powers designed African economies around one thing: extraction. Raw materials out, profits out. Nothing left behind but poverty and instability. That same model lives on today, maintained not by European empires, but by Western multinational corporations and post-colonial elites who refuse to challenge the system. This dependency gives foreign powers, like the United States and the UK, endless room for manipulation. A military base? All it takes is the promise of aid, a handshake, a deal made behind closed doors. In exchange for land and loyalty, African nations are offered temporary support, while foreign militaries plant themselves next to oil fields, mines, and gas reserves. Don't take our word for it. Look at the map. In São Tomé and Príncipe, the U.S. established a lily pad base in the Gulf of Guinea. Officially, it was to fight Islamic militancy, ISIS, Al-Qaeda. But local governments confirmed those threats barely exist there. What does exist, however, is oil. Nigerian oil, Gulf of Guinea oil, billions of dollars in oil. Another example? In 2007, 1.7 billion barrels of oil were discovered at the border of Congo and Uganda, near Lake Albert. What happened next? Immediate militarization, not by local forces, but by the U.S. military. Coincidence or strategy? And it's not just about resources, it's about rivalry. Those who oppose shutting down Africom aren't talking about terrorism. They're talking about China and Russia. The fear that these global players are gaining ground in Africa. General Langley himself confirmed it. Maintaining Africom is about preserving U.S. dominance on the continent. And that's exactly why Langley pleaded with African leaders. Not for peace, not for partnership, but for power. So if African leaders are wise, if they truly want to break free from dependency and reclaim their sovereignty, they'll welcome Africom's exit with open arms. What do you think? Is Africom helping Africa or hurting it? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful content like this. Africa deserves the truth, and the world needs to hear it.